So here's my pitch. I think if you're going to call it medical marijuana, then treat it like it's medicine, and we're not. And if you're not going to call it medical marijuana, but yet you're still going to allow it as a product to be consumed in the community, then treat it like a product that the consumer ought to be warned about the risks associated with the consumption of that product.
District Attorney Kunzweiler has done a phenomenal job in Tulsa County since his election. He's up for re-election next year, is that correct? No. Oh, you just got re-elected. Okay, never mind. So he's not making the speaking tours just because he's getting re-elected. So,
He's not the typical politician.
No, he's not. And he's done a phenomenal job. If there's things that we don't agree with or we have question about, he's never hesitant to respond to us or answer our questions. So, Steve, if you want to come on up here and, you know, like I said, if you want to talk about whatever, sex, drugs, rock and roll. Who's your favorite rock and roll band?
Leonard Skinner. Well, also, ELO, Electric Light Orchestra. I'm a big fan of them. Is that somebody's water, or can I steal that? I'm gonna grab that before I get going. No, I'm good.
You sure? Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me out. I want to kind of thank you for hosting meetings like this. The Christmas party is fun. And that's kind of how I really got into it. Back when I ran, and I was elected in, I guess 2013 was the election, and 2014 was the first year of the, if I remember that right. But I went to that Christmas party, and the hardest part about the Christmas party is if you're not a top-rung candidate, you have to wait until all the other top-rung candidates get through their talks. And so I was there for a very long while. But ultimately, well, no, actually not. You know, I said what I had to say, and what was beneficial to me as a candidate was the sincerity of the people who were there, who came up and said, hey, listen, I like your message, but you need to improve on this, or you need to deliver differently on that. You don't get that in any other setting, I think. So it was very helpful for me just to hear regular folk who actually had a passion for people going into elected office to say, listen, I like you, but fix this. So that was very helpful, and that taught me a lot about this group and the folks that are important to Republican politics. So, so sex, drugs, rock and roll. Let's. If you were at the Terra meeting, I gave a talk, and it's important for me to kind of repeat that. And so I am going to repeat some of the things that you heard there, because there my talk was primarily focused on drugs, because you need to know what's going on. So we have problems. When I was a very young prosecutor, I started in September of '89. I did child support enforcement for about a year and a half, but then in '91, started really in the criminal aspect of prosecution. And you may have to take yourself back to what life was like back in the late 80s or early 90s to appreciate where we are today, especially when it comes to drugs. So I asked the people at the crowd at the Tulsa Area Republican Assembly, what was the big drug that hit us in the late 80s, early 90s? What was the thing that hit us? Right, crack. So a lot of familiar faces, right? Crack cocaine, right? So what was it that was unique about crack cocaine than any other drug? Because we always had drugs, right? I grew up in an environment, I wasn't around it, but my parents made me aware that you had to be careful about what was going on. I watched things like Dragnet and Adam 12 and Emergency, and they always had storylines of somebody ODing. And so I learned a little bit that, gosh, I guess people take drugs. Well, what was different about crack cocaine, at least in my opinion, was for the first time, I think we saw as a country three things combined in the exact same drug. And what was that? A highly addictive drug, which was inexpensive and easy to manufacture. You know, cocaine you could get, but it was really expensive. And it was probably somewhat hard to acquire because you had to go down to Colombia and get it, right? Somebody figured out how to make crack cocaine, cooked it up in a skillet, made these little concentrated rocks of cocaine and could sell it for 10 or 20 bucks. And it gave an immediate and instant high to the people who were consuming it. And it was a highly addictive drug. So that was the wave that hit us as a country back in the late 80s, early 90s. It was primarily concentrated within one demographic from my recollection. Primarily the African Americans or the black community were the people that were beset with crack cocaine. Our laws at the time, which had been built, you know, you hear about 3 strikes you're out. Oklahoma has, I don't know if I would call it 3 strikes you're out, but it's essentially says, if you get your first felony, you could be eligible for some type of probation. If you get a second felony, you could get some probation or you could go to prison. If you get convicted, and when I'm saying if you get a felony, I'm talking about actually convicted, because in Oklahoma, if you get caught stealing something from Walmart over $1,000, the first time you get caught, you're probably going to get a deferred judgment and have the opportunity to get that off your record. So you actually have to have a felony conviction for it to really count on that 3 strikes you're out. So by the time you pick up your 3rd felony conviction under Oklahoma law, back at the time when I got into it, that law said you're ineligible for probation. That's the way the law read. So you were prison bound. The question was, how much time? You know, we wouldn't give probation to violent offenders. You know, the whole point was take the violent offenders off the streets. Well, when crack cocaine hit, think about that dynamic. If you are getting hooked on a highly addictive drug and you're in court, your focus is probably, yeah, I'm a little scared about the court process, but what I'm more worried about is where am I going to get my next rock of crack cocaine? And so what we saw was people who would come into court, you give them their probation, you try and get them on some kind of program and get treatment and say, listen, dude, you're going to have to address this. You need to get a drug and alcohol assessment and let's get you cleaned up. Well, because it was relatively new to us, we didn't appreciate just how rapidly addictive it was. And Doc, you kind of know about that. We dealt with that for so much in the criminal justice system. So what I saw was in my opinion, historically, by the time you were picking up your 3rd felony conviction, you're probably into your 30s. But we were seeing people who were 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, who were racking up felonies just like that. And so you had this flow of people who were coming and repeatedly coming into the court system, and because our law said you're ineligible for probation, now you started seeing this rise of incarceration going into the Department of Corrections. And it was about during that time that prosecutors and judges were starting to realize that, and that's where you saw, at least in my opinion, the origins of drug court. There wasn't any kind of state-mandated program, but courts were starting to say, hey, this is different, and we're going to have to do something to try and attack the problem. So you had little different communities across the country who were just starting to say, let's do something a little bit differently to try and address it. And yet the onslaught kept going. So then the next question I had for the group and for you, obviously, and we're going to have an answer really quick, was what was the next drug that hit us, right?
Come on, Mama. Trying to think, what was it? Methamphetamine.
Meth, right? Yeah, methamphetamine. So, that was a drug that, I didn't know about it, had no clue what that was about. But when it first hit, they would report that this is a drug that the Nazis were using to keep their soldiers up for 72 hours at a time. We have a German guest here, so may know that whole history. But now it's coming back. And if you remember how it was produced back in the mid-90s or so, we had meth labs, legitimate meth labs, not like doctor-run labs, but people in their garages or in their apartments or in their barns or whatever buildings they had, literally had constructed an elaborate system to take anhydrous ammonia and all these other very volatile chemicals and then, boil it down to something that constituted methamphetamine. And what was the real reality of that was you'd see these fires cropping up all over our community. And when it really got to epidemic proportions, we were having fires in apartment complexes and innocent people were burning up. And we had prosecutions that were oriented over somebody manufacturing meth who then was responsible for the death of another human being. And you also saw people in our community who had horrific burn marks. You'd see them in Walmart with their arms all scarred up, what were they buying? Sudafed or lithium batteries or whatever it was. It didn't matter to them. They just got burned up maybe 2 weeks ago, and they're right back at, I've got to get my meth. Once again, what was that trifecta I'm talking about? A highly addictive drug, relatively easy to manufacture, and inexpensive. It became really easy to manufacture when they figured out the what they call the pot method or whatever, where you could make it in a 2-liter bottle. And so that was exceptionally volatile. If you got that little lithium battery in there with all those other chemicals, and you'd watch it just glowing literally as it's churning and bubbling and creating that film that they'd scrape off to make their meth. So once again, you had fires happening, but now you could transport it in your car, or you could make it out back in your yard or something like that. So, once again, we got overtook. Yes, ma'am.
The cooks of the meth really prided themselves on how well they could cook it. So it became like a competition to make the best meth.
Exactly.
Well, isn't it a skill like any other? Isn't it a trade like any other?
Yep. Yeah. So you had, what were we doing in criminal prosecution? Obviously, trying to deal with it. And yet we had this new onslaught of people coming into the criminal justice system, once again, highly addicted people, and boom, they're just, picking up the offenses. We would charge not only manufacturing, but endeavoring to manufacture, because what you'd end up finding is when you go to one of these houses of manufacturing, you'd find 5 people, not saying you all were manufacturers, but somebody owned the house. Somebody's girlfriend went out and bought the tubing. Somebody else got the Sudafed. Somebody else got the batteries. Somebody else is just kind of sitting on the sidelines, maybe helping, move things around, right? So we charge all those people with endeavoring to manufacture. We had to figure out pretty quick, and this is what I would tell my prosecutors, like, I don't care that you charge all 5, but who's the cook, right? Who's the cook? And if it was Rhonda, that's who we would focus our attention on, and then trying to deal with these 4 folks who were there just because they're waiting for their meth, right? And yet it's still churning through, highly addictive, inexpensive, and easy to manufacture. Now that system doesn't even exist anymore. The last manufacturing case I can remember in Tulsa was last year, and it was a pot growing method down, I think, on the Arkansas riverbanks among the homeless population. I can't remember a legitimate manufacturing process in Tulsa County in a long time, because
It's difficult
Mexico.
to buy pseudoephedrine.
no, Mexico. right? It is pouring across our border. I've been told by anybody who's in the business that there are manufacturing plants and big warehouses right on the other side of the border. They manufacture and then they pipeline it into our country. So, you know, the pathway to meth changed. And there are obviously opinions about how it got to that point because we made it more difficult to acquire Sudafed as one of the theories. But anyway, that's number two. That's the second wave that we hit. And my observation was the population that meth primarily was concentrated in was Caucasians. You know, so you had an African-American population beset by crack cocaine. Was there some crossover? Yes. You had methamphetamine primarily beset Caucasian population. Is there some crossover? Yes. But now you get a whole nother population, and now our prison numbers are really starting to skyrocket. And that's about the point where I think the legislators started listening to us and allowed us to statutorily create drug courts. And that's where we started to try and stream people in to say, you're prison bound, you got to get off the meth. If you want to get off the meth, we'll get you off, but you got to go through this treatment program. So then finally, what's the last thing that what's been the scourge of our existence recently? Opioids, yes. Opioids, and in many different type of combinations, right? And we think of opioids by prescription generation, right? And of course, that's really literally what it is for a lot of folks, but there's also, we're getting overrun by heroin, which is an opiate. And so you have now a new influx of inexpensive, because heroin's easy to come by on the streets, right along this corridor, a little bit further down there, you will find, or we used to have a lot of opiate distributors, heroin distributors, but it comes from China. Yes, sir.
Can I ask one question? Because you probably all know. I know about the opiate price, and I know every year is like 72,000 Americans who die currently because of it. But what's the situation like in Oklahoma? Because I don't know how badly affected is Oklahoma from it, and like.
So we the last information that I have that you know, it's one of the leading causes of death as far as illegal activity, outpacing many other illegal activities, and that's just because its effect on the human brain. I literally am dealing with, we're prosecuting some cases now where we're going after the heroin distributors if we can tie the distribution to somebody who died at the hospital. I currently have 2 cases pending in which we have 2 separate individuals where we were able to, after the victim died, we started deconstructing their history and figuring out through their cell phones, all right, how did this person come by their fentanyl, which is usually a cut into heroin, or now we're seeing actually pure fentanyl, highly, highly toxic and highly lethal if it's ingested. So we're trying to prosecute the deliverer for the homicide. Hopefully to put a footprint or a boot heel on those folks to say, listen, you know, I guess if you're going to be caught up in drug dealing, you might want to deal with something less lethal. Because if people are dying because they're ingesting your drug and we can prove it, we're coming after you. So that's what we're doing. Anyway, we're getting overrun by that, but we also had an onset of synthetic cannabinoids, K2. I don't know if you remember that. We don't see a lot of that lately. David, what's going on?
I have to ask then, if that's going to be the standard that you just laid out, how many doctors and pharmacists have you arrested?
Well, you got to remember what the Oklahoma Attorney General, that's been his marching orders to the AG's office, and he actually has charged a doc, I think, down in Oklahoma County, and they're paying.
That are ending these opiate mills, and these guys are rampant. They're all over the place.
I agree. I agree.
Where are the arrests? Because I see a double standard.
Well, I don't have the answer for you, because the Attorney General is a person who's concentrating on that. So he's looking at, you know, you got the PMP deal that requires people who are providing those medications to maintain a log or a record that, hey, I'm giving to this person this opiate, And the next person down the line, if they show up and they come to this pharmacy and then they go to that pharmacy, that other pharmacy ought to be checking the PMP to say, well, you just got a prescription yesterday for the same thing. If this pharmacy then gave, they could be held accountable because they're not paying attention to the tracking. It's pretty shocking. I'm telling you, it's pretty shocking that there are some mills. Saw a video about a month ago where they just put a camera right outside this strip mall where this doc had basically set up a pain management clinic, and I think they had the doc and the office manager, and you could tell people would be milling around, and the doc drove a very distinguishable car, and as soon as he rolled up in the lot, it was just like, bees swarming on a flower just descended on it, and you had a line running outside the office. So they're working on it, but it takes resources, which is always a problem for us, but I know we're working on that. So anyway, so we've been beset with crack cocaine, methamphetamine, opiates, and the challenge for us is to try and figure out how to bring that down. That's why we have all this criminal justice reform issue going on, to try and address it. I have a different view on what's actually literally crowding the prisons. Oklahoma passed 85% laws for a lot of violent type crimes. The true metric from what I'm seeing is we have people who are staying longer time in jail. And that is actually what's going to be the big issue for Oklahoma is, are we going to maintain 85% for certain crimes? Because if we continue to maintain 85%, which means if you get a 10-year sentence, you got to do 85% of that sentence, which is 8.5 years before you become eligible for parole. Historically, back when I first got into the gig, back in the days of Willie Horton or whatever, you'd had people, remember Willie Horton was getting released, I think, by Dukakis or whoever it was, got released early and then went out and killed somebody. So remember, that's where 85% kind of came from, is like, these people need to spend more time in prison. Well, we're either going to have to build a larger facility, or we're going to have to figure out, at what point do you sustain 85%, or do you start ratcheting that down a little bit based on age, which I think is going to be something you're going to see in the legislative discussion in the next few years. Is, you get some guys who are up in their 60s and 70s and even 80s, and the question really becomes, okay, you committed one of these violent offenses, what's the risk to the community now because of your age? Yes, ma'am.
I guess what I'm trying to of the people that are in prison right now, how many of them do you feel are rehabilitatable? Is that a word?
Well, I really have concerns about that, because we call it the Oklahoma Department of Corrections, and I'm seeing nothing that involves corrections. It's more the Oklahoma Department of Housing.
Babysitting, right.
Because for whatever reason, I don't run the books for the Department of Corrections, but program after program after program have been cut. One of the biggest concerns for mine was the availability of treatment for sex offenders, the people that all of us are really worried about, child molesters and rapists, and the availability of treatment for those individuals is, I don't even know if it's happening now. So essentially, you warehouse somebody who's committed a very violent offense. They become somewhat institutionalized. They're probably associated. I suspect we put most child molesters in a population together as opposed to general population just for their own safety. I don't know if they're getting any treatment or not, but I'm worried about those guys getting back into the community.
Is there some way we could, like on the child molester thing, and is there some way that they could categorize it? Because if you ever caught, I had a woman call me and she needed a place to live. She said that that she had been drinking and went to the bathroom out in the park.
Yep.
And so she and her daughter needed a place to live. And we're too close to a school. We couldn't accommodate her. But.
So what she's talking about is in Oklahoma we have sex offender registration, and so in principle that sounds like a really good idea, that you ought to register yourself so that the community knows where you're living. But we also have limitations on where sex offenders can live. You can't be within, I think it's 1,000 feet of a school or a church or a public park. And so if you look at Tulsa, Oklahoma, there aren't a lot of places that aren't outside 1,000 feet of one of those three things, so for this offender, if the truth is that she got charged with a sex-related crime, my suspicion would be it had to have been indecent exposure, which may have fit a category for registration. That probably does affect her. Obviously, I think the law was designed to address the rapist, the child molester, but that's a legislative issue that would have to be addressed with them to decide, all right, who is it that we really need to be monitoring? But that affects our communities too, right? I always worry about the people who, because they don't have a place to stay, just choose never to register. And where are they? If you're clever enough to commit a lewd molestation, or if you're clever enough to commit a rape, you're probably also somewhat clever enough to avoid detection. You shouldn't be getting caught. You may not be registering. You may actually even have a warrant out for your arrest for failure to register, but you're going to do all the things that keeps you under the radar from being detected. Maybe you don't drive. Maybe you don't get a job where your income can be tracked through Social Security or taxes. So, don't have the exact answer for that, but that's another issue we have to address. So finally, at the end of my drugs discussion is this conversation, and I brought this up at that last meeting. I would encourage you to read this book. The title is Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence. So this book was written by a gentleman by the name of Alex Berenson, and I'll have this book out. You can take a picture of it if you want. Alex Berenson is a former New York Times reporter. I generally don't trust much of anything that comes from the New York Times, which is what made me think, why would a New York Times or former New York Times write something like this? So Pat Campbell loaned me this book, and I read through that, and it is pretty shocking what we don't know that other countries across the world who have been dealing with marijuana in Europe know that we don't know. So, I gave a discussion at a lawyer group. They had a forum in which I was asked to be on, and the name of the forum was called Cannabis Law, Opportunities and Pitfalls. I'm sorry, but that was a bit offensive to me as a prosecutor, because I don't consider necessarily it to be an opportunity or a pitfall. I look at it as, is there a risk or not with the consumption of that stuff? And I think we have been lulled somewhat into a sense of, hey, it's okay, but I don't think that we really have examined it to the extent that we should. So here's my pitch. I think if you're going to call it medical marijuana, then treat it like it's medicine, and we're not. And if you're not going to call it medical marijuana, but yet you're still going to allow it as a product to be consumed in the community, then treat it like a product that the consumer ought to be warned about the risks associated with the consumption of that product. You can turn on your TV every day, or you can turn on your radio every day, and somebody's going to be talking about some product that's out there, and they'll be rolling across the screen, or you'll be hearing this announcer overhead or over the visuals talking about, hey, don't be taking this particular drug if you're if you're a diabetic, or if you've got a liver condition, or whatever the heck it is. We owe that, at least in my opinion, to the consumers of marijuana to know actually what the deal is. So I just read a little bit. All the things that I spoke about previously on marijuana at this forum is all literally pulled from this book. And I'm telling you, you need to read it. So I said in his January 2019 book, Tell Your Children the Truth About Marijuana, Mental Illness, and Violence, former New York Times reporter Alex Berenson's introduction is a quote from C.P. Baudelaire's The Generous Gambler. And here's his quote. "The loveliest trick of the devil is to persuade you that he does not exist." Berenson acknowledges that using cannabis or any drug is ultimately a personal choice. What to do about legalization is a political decision, but whether marijuana is dangerous to the brain and can ultimately cause violence is a scientific question with a hard yes or no answer. Those are his words. I told the groups I was talking about, I hate to be the spoiler about the book, and I encourage everyone to read the book, but the answer is yes to that question. Berenson, in the most figurative of terms, describes it this way. The black tide of psychosis and the red tide of violence are rising together on a green wave, slow and steady and certain. All anyone has to do is look. So he goes and digs and goes back a couple hundred years to all the reports that kind of, when people were consuming marijuana, this just wasn't something that we cooked up in the 30s and 40s. Marijuana's been around for a long time, and there's been reported observations of people using marijuana. And so he went and dug it all up. He found a study out of Sweden, Sven Andersson's Cannabis and Schizophrenia. It's called a longitudinal study of Swedish conscripts. It was generated in December 26 of 1987. So because we don't do a very good job of tracking consumption of drugs, we don't, in the United States, one of the things that he had kind of notices, the European model of research is more on epidemiology. That when they're going out and they encounter something and they're going to research something, a lot of times they're looking at saying, all right, here's something that's happening. What's causing that? So their typical research bend is to invest their money in epidemiology, to figure out what's happening and what's its impact on the community. American research tends to be more on the cellular or molecular level to say, all right, what is it and its effect on the brain, and what can we do to perhaps interrupt that? So one side leans a little bit more towards, what its impact might be on the community. The other side kind of looks at, well, is there something we can do to interrupt its effects? And so because of that, there are a lot more published studies in Great Britain and in Europe and in Australia and New Zealand that he's pulling from. They have been looking at marijuana and they've been following it. So this Swedish study, they when people were being conscripted or drafted into the military in Sweden, they had a questionnaire and they would ask every last one of them things about who are you, what's your date of birth, some family history, and drug consumption. Very good fact-intensive information. So because those questions had been asked, this researcher then started saying, all right, well, let's start and look at that and see, can we learn something from what they reported. And so what that study did was firmly demonstrate a statistical link between consuming marijuana and schizophrenia. They said that cannabis was responsible for 10 to 15% of the schizophrenia cases in the study. Out of New Zealand, there's this thing called the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study. They got like 1,000, a little over 1,000, I think 1,037 children born between April of 72 and March of 73, and then they just started tracking them, following them through their life. So it's an ongoing study. And what they had learned was that people who had used cannabis at the age of 15 were 4 times more likely to develop schizophrenia or schizophreniform syndrome as those people who had never used. The converse of that, because of how the research is doing, is Great Britain has seen a different effect on marijuana consumption than we have. He pointed out that Great Britain's rate of marijuana use has plunged over the last several years because of a lot of research that they've done. Because they've been researching it and publishing it, their population is a little bit more educated. He pointed out in 2005 in the United States and Great Britain, our consumption of marijuana were pretty identical. However much marijuana is being consumed in Great Britain roughly equated to what was going on in the United States. But by 2016, the American adult rates had risen 50%, while the British rate of consumption had plummeted by 1/3. Why is that? Well, because we're not hearing what's out there in Great Britain and in Europe. They're actually hearing what's out there. So our own National Academy of Medicine in January 2017, they have been doing some research, and they published this, but I don't know that you hear this. Their report in January 2017 said the association between cannabis use and development of a psychotic disorder is supported by data synthesized in several good quality systematic reviews. The magnitude of the association, so consumption of marijuana and its association with schizophrenia or a psychiatric disorder, the magnitude of this association is moderate to large and appears to be dose dependent. What does that mean? When we're watching the weather, right now. When you watch Travis Meyer and he gets up there and he's trying to predict what was going to happen in Tulsa, Oklahoma on Thursday and Friday and Saturday, he tells you something like there's a slight risk of rain, 20%. Or he might say there's a moderate risk, 50%. Or there's a high risk, 80, 90, 100%. So this National Academy of Medicine is saying the magnitude of the association is moderate to large and appears to be dose dependent. What Berenson further went into was to look at, all right, well, not only is there apparently a causal connection between consumption of marijuana and psychiatric issues. What he said, the illustration he gave was this. What do we know about cigarette smoking? What's the one thing we know about cigarette smoking?
It's not good for you.
What?
It's not good for you.
Yeah, not good. Causes cancer, right?
It can.
Right.
Doesn't always.
Right. We know smoking cigarettes causes cancer. Does everybody who smokes cigarettes get cancer? No. But does smoking cause cancer? Yes. He draws the same analogy. Does everybody who's going to consume marijuana, are they going to develop a psychiatric or disorder? No. But is there, according to his research, definitive proof that it does have a causal link to certain psychotic disorders? You bet. So that's why I would encourage you to read the book. But in addition to that, what they're finding out is from the research that you can tie some violence to the consumption of marijuana. And this, I'll kind of wrap it up here pretty quickly.
I've never seen two hippies go out in a parking lot and fight. I'm just going to say that right now.
I get that, but we're
just going to throw that out there.
We're dealing with a different product. So the Journal of Interpersonal Violence in 2013 said that students had recently used marijuana, but not alcohol, were more than 3 times likely to be physically aggressive than those who abstained from both. In psychological medicine in 2016 out of London, they said that marijuana use at all 3 surveyed ages, and this is a long study, so they looked at 18 and 32 and 48 age people. Marijuana use at all those ages demonstrated a 9-fold increase in violent behavior. Again, in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, they said that marijuana use was associated with a near doubling of the risk of committing domestic violence by the age of 26. And they put this in their report. We found that any use of marijuana during adolescence and young adulthood increases the risk of intimate partner violence. That Dunedin study that I was talking about found that people with marijuana dependence had a fourfold risk of violence, or fourfold risk for violence. They said that persons with both a cannabis disorder and a schizophrenic spectrum diagnosis were 18 times as likely to commit violence as the average person. So what's my point? We got to get ourselves educated on this. If it's going to be the law of the land in Oklahoma, and we're going to say, we're going to let our people have it, then let's get ourselves educated. I'm going to enforce the laws however they're written, but I feel like there's a duty to you all to let you educate yourselves, and our legislators need to be reading this book. And trust me, I've been sharing this information with the legislators. Before you start passing a lot of stuff, you need to pay attention to it. So this is how he wraps it up. So Berenson concludes his book with this ominous warning. And so we are in the worst of all possible worlds. Marijuana is legal in some states, illegal in others, becoming steadily more potent and sold without warnings everywhere. We have nearly ended youth cigarette smoking with pointed, well-funded advertising campaigns. Between 2002 and 2014, the rate of tobacco use among adolescents fell from 13% to 5%. Teens are now more likely to use cannabis than cigarettes. If we do nothing else, we need to commit to discouraging young people from using marijuana just as we do with tobacco. The personal and societal costs of psychosis are just too high. He goes on to say this: 20 years ago, the United States moved to allow or encourage wider use of two drugs, cannabis and opiates. In both cases, we ignored hundreds of years of warnings. We decided that we knew better, that we could outsmart the drug and somehow have its benefit without costs. We were wrong. Opiates are far riskier, of course, and the overdose deaths they cause are more obvious, and so we focused on those. But soon enough, the mental illness and violence that marijuana causes will be too widespread to ignore. That's the point of the book. Read the book. Maybe you'll be persuaded by it. Maybe you won't, but I think we all owe it to ourselves to get ourselves educated. I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk too much about the sex or the rock and roll, but I will open it up to questions. And Congress, I heard you on the
yes, Congressman Hearn just walked in, so we'll give him a few minutes here shortly.
I'll yield the floor to the congressman easily. So.
I just want to come out and share something with you all that we got last night.
Well, hang on. Go ahead. Well, no, Steve, I'm just kind of curious on the book. Are you sure that's not three different subjects? It's marijuana, comma.
Yes. No, it's tell your children the truth about marijuana, comma, mental illness, comma, and violence.
But it doesn't say that mental illness and violence is necessarily
well, that's the point of his book. You got it. You have to read the book to figure it out, right? All I'm saying is, I tend to think in this group, we tend to be very skeptical of certain folks. But if a former New York Times reporter is going to go out and do the investigation and put his name out on the line, we probably owe it to ourselves to read this thing and decide for yourself, do you believe it or not? He's very resource heavy in this book. This isn't him saying a lot of stuff. He's given information that's well out there and available to all of us.
And you don't want to talk about the massage parlors?
Oh, sure. Okay, yeah. All right, yeah. There you go. That's where the sex comes in. So, touche. All right, so you saw this probably about 10 days ago. We had a fairly big press conference, and at one point we got involved, law enforcement, the vice team at Tulsa Police Department. You're always trying to figure out how can you get these, you're addressing human trafficking, and you're starting to learn more about that nasty, dark underbelly of society. And, the historical perspective of prostitution that when I first came to Tulsa, I went to the University of Tulsa, and And I remember on a wall in one of the restrooms at the law school, there was something written about 11th Street prostitutes, right? On 11th Street in Tulsa, that's where I guess people knew to go to hook up with a prostitute. That corridor really doesn't exist. I don't see a lot of things coming out of there because, like most crime, they adapt and change with the times. So it's become much more of a social media-driven platform that the people who are purveying and manipulating victims of human trafficking have moved underground, and they are making those services available through the internet on the dark web. So as we were starting to dig, we started realizing that this subculture was existing there, and figured out that a lot of, there are massage parlors here, believe it or not, that are illicit. They're not the spa massage. They're providing sex, and they are selling sex out of those massage parlors. And so we started digging into that, and we were able to clearly establish that they were running off of subgroup apps where you had to ask for membership onto the platform, and then once you were accepted into membership, then you could set up your appointment, and then they'd line you up a hotel, and they'd have the prostitute or whomever it was show up to deliver the services. Well, the research and the current, I don't know if I would call it a trend, but the current best practices approach to try and eliminate human trafficking is to try and concentrate on the demand side. So that's what we did. We were able to grab a lot of information. When you run a search warrant on one of these operations, or you arrest somebody who's associated with that, they all have cell phones, and so you download all that information, and pretty soon you get a pretty good client list. And the clients don't necessarily identify themselves by their name. They might have Big Bob or Happy Jake or something like that. But there's a phone number associated with that. Well, that's why you hire analysts. And so we started cross-referencing a lot of this information and could figure out, oh, Big Bob is X or Happy Jake is Y. And so we made somewhat of a splash. We took down 4 of these operations, but the point of the entire press conference was not only to raise awareness of the issue in our community, but to make sure the demand side guys now know you're not going to be immune anymore. We're coming after you. So, shocker of all shockers, we've had 3 or 4 attorneys since that press conference who have called us to say, I have a client who's told me, and he has a lot at risk if it becomes known, and is there anything we can do to try and resolve whatever's going on? So obviously I think that is a real problem for that guy or that gal. It's probably affecting relationships and stuff. I'd love to have that guy get his act cleaned up and let him spend his money on things on his family as opposed to going towards whatever his issues are. So we're going to try and figure out how to address some of these issues. There's going to be obviously some people that deserve criminal prosecution, but the whole point is if we can eliminate demand, then we can help out those human trafficking victims who are out there.
How is Tulsa in regard to child trafficking? I mean, I know it's a nationwide.
So Jason Weiss, I don't know if you need to have Jason Weiss. Have you had him out here?
No.
Jason Weiss is a guy who's from Colorado. He and his wife set up a thing called the Demand Project. You need to invite him out here. You need to have him talk with you. They're in the midst of creating what I think will be the largest center for human trafficking victims. I'm confident they will fill every bed they have. I think they have anywhere from 30 to 45 beds, but they'll be able to fill those beds up very quickly. The hardest part about human trafficking is those victims almost get what was Stockholm syndrome, right? Where, this is really sad. A lot of children who go through the juvenile system, who are deprived children, who are removed and their parental rights are terminated, they age out. And there is no place for them to land. At 18, Doc, you know this, right? At 18, once they're cut loose, unless the state provides some kind of landing for them, they're just kind of out there with no mom, no dad, probably were abused, probably have a lot of other issues, disconnected from family. Where do the snakes of society go to? They target that kid, and they roll her into their deal. And for the first time, that young girl is experiencing attention. It's perverted attention. And then they think, well, that's what love is. And so they become linked emotionally to the trafficker, and they know something's wrong, but a lot of the victims that I deal with, it's the concept of, do I go back to the thing that I know, which I don't like, or do I venture out into the thing I don't know and I don't know what to expect? So a lot of child sexual abuse victims, a lot of times they don't even want to disclose because the fear is I'm going to lose my home and whatever. So it's the
like a gang mentality where it's a family.
Right, and so it's awful. It's an awful dynamic. So it's pretty prevalent, and the hardest part is being able to pull that young lady out and knowing that she's probably been indoctrinated for 3 years or so. She knows no other life, and then here we're pulling her into. I mean, it'd be like me taking somebody in that restaurant who's having a breakfast, who's never met any one of you, and saying, we're going to pull you out of your environment. Here you are. You're safe. And she looks at all of you, and you all are complete strangers, and yet that other guy that's in there is more friendly to her. Maybe he's beating her, but he also gives her money and a roof over her head. It's a frightening experience for them. So we try the best we can. So good question on that.
Thanks. Does anybody have any questions for Steve?
Sorry, that's heavy stuff. It really is, and I'm sorry, but that's the nature of the beast, and I appreciate your support. And the flip side is, and you guys know this, there's no crying in prosecution. I don't care what your position is. If you need to drill into my ear and tell me something I need to hear, like David frequently does, I'm okay with that. You are not going to hurt my feelings. Yes, sir.
I have one kind of question. A lot of times it's argued that if you legalize marijuana or you get medical marijuana out there, that the criminal cost to get to the dealers and everything go away because there are no dealers anymore and you don't have to persecute them anymore. So since it's now medical marijuana is available now in Oklahoma, right? Mm-hmm. So did that rate drop the whole criminal aspect connected to it or not?
You know what's shocking is, do you guys read the stories in the paper about marijuana dispensaries getting burglarized? Yes. Right? I mean, it's the criminal element. Think about the process. It's a cash business, right? Under a law of our country, you can't, because marijuana is illegal on the federal level, you can't derive cash proceeds and deposit those in a federal insured bank. So they operate on a cash-only business. And if you've got really good marijuana or you operate on cash-only business, who wants that stuff? A competitor, right? So a good analogy to this is with illegal immigration, what we found is people who are here illegally who want to stay here, they operate on cash-only businesses. Well, the gangs figured that out, and so they would target Hispanic businessmen because they're carrying wads of cash, and they would hit them and they'd rob them, and the Hispanic victims, and they're truly victims, wouldn't want to report because they're afraid they're going to get deported by reporting. And so you create this subculture of crime because of some of that dynamic. So that's a comparable issue that we still have to try and figure out and navigate. One other aspect of the medical marijuana, I don't know if you saw in the paper earlier this week, but as I saw the Tulsa World reported that we have yet in Oklahoma to have one single lab certified to provide verification that the marijuana that's being dispensed actually passes the criteria for purity, I guess, what you say. So there's no laboratory in this state that's actually testing the marijuana that's being consumed by our citizens And whether you know what's in that marijuana or not. Is there pesticides in there? Is there metals in there? We don't know it, but we're slinging it.
Parsley, lots of parsley.
Do we have any testing going on for other things besides just marijuana, like our foodstuffs? So we don't know
Oh, I
what's
know.
coming in those, especially when they're coming from out of.
David, I totally agree. That you and I already had this conversation a little bit. I totally agree with that. I mean, there's an irony to it that, you know, you can watch and say, hey, yes, you ingest this stuff because it's going to elevate your testosterone level or whatever. And I'm sitting there thinking, how do you know what's in that stuff? And, you know, that's what the FDA exists for. I don't know why we allow the consumption of things that could be damaging to your body, but that's a conversation for another day.
Thank you so much, Steve. We appreciate you very much.